Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're covering the case of Genie Wiley. As those of you who've been watching me for a while know, I don't feel very comfortable talking about cases involving children, especially when the details are very graphic. Obviously, I have to say here that we won't be showing any disturbing images or anything like that. We're just going to talk about what happened. But it's still an extremely sensitive topic, something I really don't like talking about at all. Still, this story in particular does have a satisfying resolution. I'm not going to say it's a happy ending, because a happy ending, it's not, but it does have a resolution. And at least the victim in this case was able to have a life beyond everything she went through. Honestly, in this story, it's impossible to avoid the darker parts. And I want to focus on telling you the facts in an objective and engaging way, because this is literally the worst case of child abuse in history. That title, by the way, wasn't chosen by me, but by historians and other experts in the field who compared it to cases from the Middle Ages, just to give you an idea. Besides being terrible from start to finish, this case is also known for still sparking controversy, scientific debates, and ethical and moral discussions even today. And with nothing more to add, let's get started. Usually, every case I cover on the channel follows the same structure. A biography to get to know the main figures in each case, their lives before the events, their backgrounds, the events themselves, what happened and how. And finally, moving on to the investigation and trial as a way to bring closure to what happened. A conclusion, so to speak. However, in today's case, it's impossible to use such a clearly defined or structured division, much less the order we're used to. Mainly because Genie Wiley didn't have a life before the events. She didn't exist for anyone outside her family, and to them, she was anything but human. So, what we can consider the main event in this case is the discovery of her existence and the horrible condition she had lived in up until then, which is really just one way to put it. In reality, it was survival. Jeannie's discovery happened because of an unintentional mistake by her mother, Dorothy Irene Wiley, who on November 4th, 1970, went to the Public Services Office in Los Angeles, United States, to apply for a disability pension. For years, her vision had been severely affected by cataracts in both eyes. For those who don't know what we're talking about, cataracts form when the lens of our eyes becomes cloudy, which causes vision to decrease. Obviously, this is a very brief and superficial definition of what this condition is, but it helps us get an idea of how Dorothy's vision was affected. For several years, she had noticed her eyesight gradually getting worse. That morning, then, she went to the Public Services Building for the reason I mentioned earlier. Besides this, there are different versions as to why she went there. Although sources agree that she was accompanied by her daughter, Susan Wiley, when her husband, Clark Wiley, left the family home to go grocery shopping. In other words, taking advantage of her husband's distraction, Dorothy went to the Public Services Building in an attempt to get financial assistance so she could become independent. But instead of going to the office that specialized in granting these subsidies, Dorothy went into the Social Services office. This mistake, undoubtedly caused by her poor eyesight, wouldn't get her the financial assistance she wanted, but it would definitely change her life. The woman who helped Dorothy immediately focused her attention on the little girl beside her. At first, she estimated that the girl was no more than 6 or 7 years old, very small and skinny, showing various signs of neglect from her family. She looked neglected, dirty, and very pale. On top of that, she seemed to have an attitude that was a mix of shyness and fear. In fact, that woman remembered thinking of Susan as a little white bunny, so tiny, fragile, and pale. When she walked, it was almost like she hopped a little, and her arms were always bent, with her hands curled up against her chest. Let's remember that she was a social worker, whose job was to recognize these warning signs of what could be a case of child abuse. And fortunately, she trusted her experience, immediately opening a case file on the Wiley household, which would bring police and other state workers to the home. The social worker tried to talk to the girl, discovering that, in addition to what she had already observed, the girl simply didn't speak at all, which at first led her to think that she might be on the autism spectrum. While that might have explained the girl's behavior to her at the time, and even some of the other attitudes she had noticed, it didn't explain her appearance or how neglected she was at all. Thanks to the social worker's quick action, there was no need for a lengthy investigation to uncover little Susan's story. Just as quickly, she was removed from her parents and placed in state custody. This is, without a doubt, the most sensitive and even horrible part to tell and to hear. Of course, we can't even begin to imagine what it must have been like to live through it. After a thorough investigation and interviews with Susan's mother, it was learned that she was the couple's fourth child. Between Dorothy and Clark Wiley, and starting from when she was just 20 months old, a little over a year, Susan was confined to a tiny room, dark and dirty, until November 4th, 1970. Being isolated from the world is the right way to describe the situation Susan was subjected to. She had never socialized with anyone, not even her parents or her brother. They never spoke to her, and if they wanted to communicate or make themselves understood, they did so through grunts and barking, especially her father and brother. So it's almost obvious that she was never educated, much less treated with care or love. But unfortunately, the list of abuse and neglect goes on. Inside the room, Susan spent her days in a homemade straitjacket that her father had devised so she couldn't move her arms. And as if that weren't enough, during the day, she was chained to what would be known as a chamber pot or potty, only able to move her fingers and toes. In other words, her father tied her up in such a way that she couldn't move an inch of her body or have contact with anything. She couldn't play, she couldn't walk, she couldn't even move the slightest bit. She could only stare into the void. At night, her situation didn't get any better. When they didn't forget about her, they would untie her from the potty, only to tie her to a baby crib without taking off the straitjacket. Just like with the potty, her father had modified the crib. Where cribs usually have wooden bars or some other material to keep a child from falling and getting hurt, her father had replaced them with wire mesh to make sure Susan stayed inside, locked in. In addition to this modification, Clark had also put a roof on the crib for the same reasons. On the rare occasions when she was fed, it was her brother who took care of it, since her father had no interest in doing so, and Dorothy was unable to because of her eye problem. Clark was the one who gave the orders. Both Dorothy and her son, whose name we don't know, were too terrified of him to even try to argue with what he said. Following these orders, the boy, who was only a little older than Susan, would give her food. Her diet basically consisted of liquids, especially milk and baby food, which clearly affected her physical as well as mental development. Remember that when she came in, accompanying her mother to the state offices, the social worker was convinced she couldn't be older than 8 because of her physical build. And even for a girl that age, Susan looked way too skinny. We'll talk more about this later, but just so you get an idea, when Susan was hospitalized at age 13, she weighed only 26 kilos. At home, like I said, no one talked to her, but there was also nothing for her to listen to. Really. Her mother and brother spoke in whispers to avoid bothering Clark, who, as we'll see a bit later, hated any kind of noise. This was something that, without a doubt, was even worse for Susan, who, having never heard anyone speak or been taught to do so, could only communicate through sounds. She was the victim of terrible beatings every time she made any sounds, whether to ask for food or anything else. It's important to understand that the abuse she suffered had not only physical and psychological consequences. For her, this meant not only that she couldn't extend her arms or hands or walk properly, but also that she suffered cognitive impairments. Susan was never able to develop cognitively. This means she never learned how to reason or think. And tasks that are simple and routine for us were impossible for her to do. The day she entered the Office of Social Services, not only was she unable to speak, but she also couldn't control her bladder or bowels. She drooled constantly and didn't know how to chew or swallow either. Solid foods. All of this would start to be taught to her once she was admitted. She would learn after being cared for, helped, and so on by several interdisciplinary groups. But before moving on to the various treatments as later stages, I think it's important to pause at the moment when everything was discovered. Who caused all of this to happen to the girl? Before delving into their parents and their story, let's remember that the girl was placed under state custody while she remained hospitalized at the Los Angeles Children's Hospital. News about a wild girl started to leak to the press, so in order to protect Susan's identity, her name was changed to Genie. The name was chosen by doctors and specialists who had come into contact with her, since they believed the girl was exactly like a genie, an incredible being who appears out of nowhere, who is undeniably unique and special. So good research, judgment, and so on. At first, after learning about the horrors Jeannie had endured, both of her parents were charged with child abuse, as evidence showed not only the mistreatment inflicted on her, but also on their other children. If you paid attention at the beginning of the case, I mentioned that the Wiley couple had 4 children. However, up until now, I've only talked about 2 of them. Jeannie and her older brother. What happened to the other 2 children shouldn't surprise us after learning what they did to the girl. But even so, it's still extremely painful to hear. According to the investigation carried out by the authorities, and according to what Dorothy herself admitted to them, it was her husband Clark who harbored a deep hatred toward children. And this didn't lessen just because they were his own children. On the contrary, the hatred seemed to become even more irrational. For example, Dorothy recounted how during her first pregnancy, Clark tried to strangle her more than once to end her life, but especially to end the life of the baby she was expecting. And although he clearly didn't succeed, the little girl died 2 months after she was born. According to the investigation, the baby was taken to the garage of the house because Clark couldn't stand living with her or her crying. The little girl died of pneumonia shortly after being abandoned, since neither of her parents took care of her. The couple's second child, a boy, died just a few days after being born, according to his mother, after choking on his own mucus. The third baby, also a boy, is Jeannie's brother, the one we've been referring to. His fate was different from that of the first 2 children and from Jeannie's own. Only because his maternal grandmother intervened, taking the little boy with her, was he educated, cared for, and raised by her. Unfortunately, the woman would die shortly after, just a few days after Jeannie was born, and the little boy had to return to his parents' house. At this point, it's necessary to pause and talk about Clark's mother's death, because according to what Dorothy recounted, this event was a turning point in his personality and way of thinking. Clark's mother was run over by a drunk driver, something similar to what had happened to his grandmother, an event he had also witnessed as a child. We can't know what went through the man's mind at that moment, but according to what his wife later stated, the abuse against her and their 2 children got worse and worse from then on. Even though, as I said before, there is no justification for what they did, many sources emphasize that Clark himself had suffered child abuse, growing up in a troubled home where his father was absent, and according to some accounts, his mother, a prostitute, was also especially violent toward him. There is no real evidence to support any of this. And even if there were, it doesn't justify or explain the evil, thank you, with which Clark treated his family. It's just an explanation of what might have happened, a cycle that ended up repeating itself in his own family. As expected, both Clark and Dorothy were charged with child abuse. And since the evidence was Jeannie herself, the trial would begin that same year, which usually takes longer. Clark, however, would not show up for it. One day before the first hearing, he took his own life with a gunshot to the head, leaving a note that read, "Thank you. The world would never understand." When Jenny's case finally became public, it attracted the interest of all kinds of scientists, doctors, linguists, and other academics. A girl who had been socialized and had gone through years. The stage of language learning and development quickly became the subject of all kinds of studies and tests. The tests made it possible to determine, for example, that at the time she was hospitalized, her brain had the development of a 1-year-old child. They also determined that certain areas of her brain were undeveloped, and the truth is, they never would be. The time Ginny spent hospitalized and under the care of an interdisciplinary team was probably the best of her life. Not only because she managed to make progress and even form connections with some of these people who would care about her and her well being for the rest of their lives, but also because she made enormous progress. When she turned 14, just 1 year later, her mental and physical development was that of a 7-year-old girl. She could understand and communicate using basic sign language, had learned to chew and swallow, and her physical problems began to disappear. Ginny could run and jump almost normally. However, all this progress would be halted and even reversed when, after being discharged, Ginny was placed in different foster homes. All of them ended up saying they were overwhelmed by the girl's needs, who went back to needing diapers all the time, in addition to having tendencies to masturbate in public and hurt herself, among other things. One of the linguists she was part of Jenny's recovery team and then applied for custody of her, which was granted for a year before being revoked and given to Dorothy, yes, Jenny's mother, who around 1975 was cleared of abuse charges and deemed capable of taking care of her. Dorothy was considered another victim of Clark, adding that the woman had no way to escape because of her vision problems. And honestly, this is pretty questionable, especially when we know that Dorothy's request to regain custody of Ginny was pushed and supported by a group of scientists, people outside her team who just wanted to get close to the girl to study her. Dorothy, however, soon handed the little girl back to the state, this time the social services, unable to care for her because of her blindness. From then on, the fight for Ginny's custody got even worse. It became a war between doctors, scientists, and others, accusing each other of using Genie, of having questionable intentions, and many other things. Noticing that this was making things worse for the girl, the social workers and other state officials in charge of Ginny banned all doctors, academics, and scientists from approaching her, even the one who had previously had custody of the girl, although she would later have brief contact with her again. Susan, that linguist, recalled in an interview a couple of years ago the last time she saw Ginny, on her 29th birthday, she said. She was miserable, hunched over, and never made eye contact. Her huge eyes were poorly focused on the cake while everyone sang to her, "Happy birthday!" It was a painful sight. That would be the last time Susan saw Ginny, about whom there has been no reliable information since then, trying to shield her from the endless attempts by the press, but above all from the scientific community's efforts to make her the subject of various projects, studies, and so on. They kept her away from all of it, and further contact with her was prohibited. In any case, Susan and other members of the first medical team that treated Ginny seem to keep in touch with Los Angeles Social Services, who, although they don't provide much information about her condition, do let them know about her well-being. As for Ginny, therefore, her exact whereabouts are unknown, but it is known that she is in an adult care facility. It is believed that she's still alive somewhere in California. Today, she would be about 70 years old. So, well, that's all the information we have for today. That is the case of Genie or Susan Wiley. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm reading them. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means. And with nothing more to say, here's a new video. Here's a recommended video, and you can subscribe by clicking on my face. See you in another video. Goodbye.